evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's wonderful to see so many of you here for what promises to be a really fantastic series of talks on new research into works from the collection of the Barber Institute of Fine Arts at the University of Birmingham. My name is Chloe Nahum. I'm the Bridget Riley Art Foundation Curatorial Fellow at the Courtauld Gallery, and I've had the really great pleasure of working with colleagues from the Barber on the loan to the Courtauld of 18 exceptional works from their collection. This is, unsurprisingly, the largest single loan of paintings they've ever made, and has been possible while the Barber is temporarily closed for a refurbishment project. The display is on at the Courtauld Gallery until the end of June 2026, and if you haven't been able to see it already, I'm in no doubt that tonight's talks will induce you to do so. And I also, of course, encourage you to visit the beautiful Barber itself once it reopens. Our display at the gallery was, of course, the catalyst for tonight's event, which brings together faculty members, curators, and conservators from both institutions to showcase some of the breadth of the research that is happening both here and there, in each case taking works from the Barber collection as a starting point. We wanted to bring members of both institutions together tonight to speak, so as to reflect what is, in some ways, a kind of shared history. The Barber and the Courtauld were founded in the same year of 1932, and from the start they were conceived along quite similar lines. Both were intended as teaching collections, that is to say, residing in universities, and both sought to bring the study of art history into the academy, as well as encouraging the general public's appreciation of visual art. There was, however, one major difference. While the Courtauld was founded with a collection, the Barber was not, and the task, we might say the rather enviable task, to build a collection from scratch was instead given to subsequent directors, with a stipulation laid down by its founder, Lady Hattie Barber, that all works acquired would be of the quality of those held in the National Gallery or the Wallace Collection. Today, the Barber and the Courtauld hold two of the finest collections of European art in the UK, as I think Lady Barber would have agreed. So, tonight's talks will take the form of 6 10-minute presentations. We will move chronologically, beginning with early Italian painting and ending tonight, though by no means in the collection itself, with German Expressionism. At the end of these 6 talks, there will be a short time for questions, so please do store up any that you may have. Following that, we are really fortunate to have a lovely coda to the evening in the form of a conversation between Professor Mark Hallett, Märit Rausing Director of the Courtauld, and Professor Jennifer Powell, Director of the Barber Institute of Fine Arts and Barber Professor of Fine Arts at the University of Birmingham. They will be discussing, I think, both the histories and futures of our two institutions, which have been at the forefront of our historical research in this country for the past 93 years. Finally, I want to thank the Research Forum team, as ever, for making tonight's event possible, and to remind you that we will be staying on to enjoy a glass of wine just down the hallway to discuss what we have heard at the end of the event, so please do stay on for that if you can. So, to kick things off, I will introduce our first speaker. Professor Aviva Bernstock is Professor of Conservation at the Courtauld. Her research includes an investigation of the materials and techniques used for painting, the characterization of visual and material changes, the application of new methods for technical study, evaluating methods for conservation practice, and a focus on the deterioration and conservation issues for modern oil paint and paintings. She is also, as of yesterday, the 2025 recipient of the Plowden Medal for Conservation. Over to you, Aviva.
Well, in parallel with the display of the Barber paintings in the Courtauld Gallery, we had the chance to undertake a technical study of the earliest painting in the Barber Institute's collection, Salerno di Coppo's Crucifixion of the Virgin and St. John the Evangelist, which was painted around 1280. And I was enormously pleased to do this. I really enjoyed this whole project very much. The study was supported by the Art Fund in a pilot project that provides regional museums and galleries with an opportunity to have works of art investigated using a range of technical methods offered by us and in collaboration with the National Gallery and the Hamilton Carr Institute in Cambridge. So it's a 3-way, and the regional museums win the chance to have this done, which was great. And the Barber picture came to us, which was even better. Here it is. There's little recent historical scholarship on Salerno di Coppo, with publications by Gertrude Kohr-Achenbach in 1946 and Anne de Bray in the 80s that address the questions of origin, style, and attribution. But our study focused on an investigation of the materials, techniques, and condition of the painting, and I'm going to show you selected highlights, discoveries, and questions that emerged from the results, because we haven't answered them all yet. The crucifixion is almost certainly the right panel of a diptych for private devotion that probably had a Virgin and Child on the left, which is now lost. The image of the Virgin and Child on the slide is by Salerno's father, Coppo de Marcavaldo. It's unrelated to the crucifixion, but of a similar scale to suggest how the diptych might have looked. Or maybe it's closer to the Rausing diptych in format. This is a diptych that was recently on show at the Metropolitan Museum, and that's the image on the upper left. There are very few paintings firmly attributed to Salerno, and to me, they have significant stylistic variations. It's very challenging to separate the hands of the father and the son in documented collaborative productions, although the Barber crucifixion looks less Byzantine in style than the works given to Marcavaldo. However, these are old paintings, and the physical history of paintings, including the impact of material changes, repairs, and many conservation interventions, can hamper judgments of style based on superficial reading. Here is one documented collaborative production, the Crucifixion in Pistoia Cathedral. There are records that Salerno was a gambler, and his father paid his debts to release him from prison to work with him on the large crucifixion and on wall paintings in the same cathedral. The Pistoia crucifixion is clearly influenced by Byzantine versions, both painted on wood and in manuscripts. And these examples are from Sinai on the left and the right of the slide. And these were suggested by Tony Eastman as generic models for the composition that show the closely similar curved body of Christ and other features that are similar to Byzantine style and derived from them. The painting technique used for the Barber crucifixion involved preparation of the poplar wood panel with a smooth white calcium sulfate gesso ground layer, and then outlining the composition using two kinds of black drawing materials, and then making incisions of some of the outlines into the gesso with a needle. This detail shows the characteristic unblended brushstrokes used for the flesh paint, the result of the fast-drying pigments used in a medium of whole egg. See those small, hope you can see, the small brushstrokes that make up the flesh paint. This microscope detail of the Evangelist shows the green underlayer of Verdaccio, where the overlying flesh paint is abraded and has become more transparent with time due to chemical changes. Also, it shows the point of a round depression at the edge of his mouth, where the compass was used as a center point to mark the halo. And I'll just point it out right here. That's the center point of a compass, which is for the halo, which you can see. Close examination of the faces of the Virgin and Evangelist under the microscope posed a question of why they appear to be smiling. It's clear that the vermilion of the lips is original, and so too the underlying black marks for the lips that appear to be turned up at the edges. Well, at first I thought this is a silly question, but I was assured by eminent historians Rob Brennan, Joanna Cannon, and Karen Sayre that the depiction of emotion is important in this period, but that the smiles might be more of a grimace, Joanna suggested. But I've struggled to find other contemporary examples of smiling or grimacing figures in crucifixions. Almost all are decidedly sad, and I've given you a few examples here. Here are details of the angels in Salerno's crucifixion. One with devastated face in hands, and the other, well, perhaps contemplative. I'm not sure. New information about the painting techniques, materials, and condition derived from X-radiography and elemental mapping of the crucifixion emerged. The image on the right is the back of, the image on your left is the back of the panel that's painted brown. On the left is the X-radiograph that shows modern nails used to attach the frame that's unoriginal to the panel. Areas of loss and filling of damages and wormholes, part of restoration treatments, are also visible in the X-ray, and some very animated marks in the background that are incongruous to the composition. I'll show you, this is the unoriginal frame, these are the damages, these are the modern nails. This is not part of the original composition. This is sort of worm damage that's been filled up. And then there's a sort of strange something going on here that's not really related to the composition at all. Mapping chemical elements present in painting materials confirmed the use of azurite blue pigment for the draperies and for the cross. And the map for silver shows the application of square sheets of silver leaf that were originally glazed with yellow paint to mimic gold. The map for zinc shows the extent of overlying campaigns of modern regilding that's very common in gold ground paintings. So that's the copper that's in the azurite paint, which is in all the blue areas of the painting. This is silver, which shows all these square sheets of silver leaf used to gild the original, which is bright silver and much cheaper than gold. And then later on, it was all regilded, which is extremely common because it wears out and it's reused for devotional purposes. Silver leaf glazing to mimic gold was quite commonly used instead of more expensive gold leaf. However, it blackens on exposure to light, pollution and moisture. Here's an example of a roughly contemporary painting where the black areas in the detail on the right, they're not dirt, but they are black and silver leaf. All of that is just black and silver leaf, and you can see that on paintings that aren't in great condition. This one is in Pisa, where I went recently. Elemental mapping of the reverse of the panel provided the most surprising finding that beneath the brown paint is what could be an inscription, painted using a lead-containing paint. Or is it simply marks related to the marbling or decoration that's commonly found on the backs of early Italian panel paintings? I don't think so. We've sent this image to several scholars of Aramaic text, but no one has yet unraveled the mystery of the hidden message. One or two of them have suggested that it's magic. It's a pseudo-script which designates this object as a relic, and I find that really pretty convincing. But scientific examination is not magic, and the application of new methods such as elemental mapping can lead to new discoveries, the significance of which is yet to be determined. But in the meantime, it poses new questions for making and the physical history of this very interesting painting. So thank you.
Thank you, Aviva. Okay, next up, Robert Wenley is Deputy Director, Collections and Research at the Barber Institute of Fine Arts. He's previously held curatorial positions at Norwich Castle Museum, the British Golf Museum, the Wallace Collection and Glasgow Museums before joining the Barber in 2010. He has particular interests in French Louis XIV period bronzes, Dutch and Flemish 17th century painting, and the history of collecting in Britain and France from 1600 to 1950. He has curated several exhibitions and published numerous articles on sculpture, collecting, and Dutch and Flemish paintings. He was reviews editor for the Sculpture Journal from 2000 to 2010 and has been chair of the Public Statues and Sculpture Association Specialist Advisory Board since 2022. He's chair of the Public Picture Gallery Fund, Birmingham, since 2019.
Thank you very much, Chloe, and thank you to the committee for inviting me to speak tonight. It's a great honour and opportunity. So good evening, everyone. My paper tonight, We're Jumping 4 Centuries, is one of the most sublime paintings in the Barber's collection, Claude Lorrain's Pastoral Landscape of 1645, acquired in 1953. While I can't pretend all the research and ideas presented here are my own, I have applied them to this painting, and I hope one day that they will form the core of an in-focus exhibition dedicated to this rich and compelling masterpiece. Just a little bit of background. Claude Lorrain, born Courtauld Gallery in 1604-05, was a French painter, draftsman and etcher He spent most of his life in Italy and was one of the earliest artists to concentrate on landscape painting. Many of his landscapes were superficially turned into the more prestigious history paintings by the addition of a few small biblical or mythological figures. Other works, like the Barbers, are pure pastorals in which the figures are essentially decorative. Claude has been acclaimed as the greatest of all painters of ideal landscapes and is regarded as the supreme master of the poetical effects of light. Although Claude's patrons were mostly French or Italian, after his death and through into the early 19th century at least, he became very popular with English collectors, and the UK retains a high proportion of his works, many still in country house collections. He was hugely admired by many English artists, not least J.M.W. Turner and John Constable, who described Claude as, quote, the most perfect landscape painter the world ever saw, unquote. Claude settled in Rome in the 1620s, but travelled locally to study nature by sketching outdoors, making oil studies on the spot. He secured his reputation in the 1630s by winning commissions successively from the French ambassador in Rome, the King of Spain, and finally the Pope. About 1636, he started cataloguing his works, making pen and wash drawings of nearly all his pictures as they were completed, and on the back of most of these drawings he wrote the name of the purchaser. This volume Claude named the Liber Veritatis, or Book of Truth. The Barber painting is a morning scene lit by the sun on horizon on the left and featuring three pastoral figures, one of whom plays a pipe, hence its Victorian era title, The Pipe Player, a reflection of the 19th century's anthropocentric tendencies. In fact, this is a picture purely about the landscape and pervading light, with the figures having no real narrative function. A drawing for the group of three cows at the right is now in the Morgan Library in New York. And as you can see, the cattle are nearly identical in our painting to the Morgan drawing. This drawing was number 46 of Claude's animal album, one of only 2 drawings from this group of 64 used in a painting. The album, having been intact for 300 years, was dismantled by a dealer in the 1950s and the sheets sold individually. The sense of harmony and equilibrium in the pastoral landscape is perhaps no accident. The composition is carefully structured so that the ratio of the section to the left of the central trees the ratio of the section to the left of the central trees to that on their right is exactly the same ratio as the ratio of the section above the horizon line, that also runs through the bridge, to that below it. These lines intersecting at the point the foliage springs from these same trees, with one of the painting's corner to corner diagonals, so you can see it's been very carefully calibrated. These ratios are close to, but not quite, on the so-called golden ratio, or phi of 1.618, discovered by the ancient Greek mathematicians. While Claude certainly would have been aware of this ratio, and is documented as having experimented with perspectival geometry, it is believed that while understanding the principles, he used them instinctively. In other words, he wouldn't have set about his canvas with a compass and ruler, but employed his experience and eye to create his own ideal proportioned landscapes. Claude's idealized landscapes are generally understood to be evocations of the countryside or campagna around Rome and made for his wealthy aristocratic patrons who lived in the city. In Claude's vision, the sun always shines, casting a golden glow across perfectly composed views of serene landscapes dotted with untroubled inhabitants and their equally content flocks and herds, the whole evocative of a perfect classical past. The topography of Claude's landscapes was informed by his constant study from life of the Roman Campagna, the rolling plains around Rome that broadly correspond to the modern region of Lazio. From his first contact with the area in the 1630s, on moving from France, he made hundreds of drawings of the Campagna on the spot, anticipating the Impressionists in working en plein air by more than 200 years. A number of his sketchbooks survived intact until relatively recently and are evidence of his diligence in accumulating landscape motifs. Joachim von Sandrart, a contemporary biographer who knew the artist, wrote that Claude, quote, tried by every means to penetrate nature, lying in the fields before the break of day and until night, in order to learn to represent very exactly the red morning sky, sunrise and sunset, and the evening hours, unquote. He particularly enjoyed high viewpoints at places like Tivoli, where he could take in the panorama of the lands below. However, thanks to the recent research of an Australian academic, Dr. Lisa Bevan, who I'd like to pay full tribute to tonight, we now understand that while Claude might have depicted lushly forested and serene landscapes, the reality of the Roman countryside in Claude's time was anything but verdantly idyllic. Severe deforestation in the preceding centuries had denuded the Campagna, and Claude's on-the-spot drawings from the area often record bare stretches of largely treeless land. Later travellers in the 18th century, expecting a Claudian idyll, often commented on the melancholy desolation of the Campagna, one describing it as sterile, deserted, sad and horrible. Work for the tourist board. Dr. Bevan believes that only one of Claude's paintings reflects the true denuded landscape of the Campagna in his day. This highly unusual from the life study of a sheepfold. It's perhaps no coincidence that he never sold this painting, bequeathing it to his nephew. Further evidence for the deforestation of the Roman Campagna comes from contemporary accounts of the famous bird market in the Piazza della Rotonda in front of the Pantheon in Rome, which records multitudes of meadow birds like lapwings and skylarks being sold rather than birds of the forest. But an even more significant issue for the local population was the climate crisis of the 17th century. In contrast to the global warming of our own times, in Claude's day, Europe was in the grip of the so-called Little Ice Age, when average temperatures dropped by at least 2 degrees centigrade from the norm. This cold period was even more severe at its peak between 1645, the very year of the barber's Claude, and 1715, when winters were so extreme that, for example, and as you may know, the Thames in London froze solid some 23 times, and sometimes to such an extent that so-called frost fairs could safely be held on the thick ice. In the Roman Campagna, this period witnessed successive very cool and very wet summers, which in turn led to a series of disastrous crop failures. Far from living an idyllic, bucolic life, the local population fell into poverty and in bad years destitution, unable to provide for their livestock and forced to survive on chestnuts or even acorns. With the land severely deforested, the excessive rain led to widespread flooding and the creation of large areas of stagnant water, swamps and fiumi morto, or dead rivers. These were the perfect breeding ground for malarial mosquitoes, leading to a huge loss of life in the region. An already impoverished rural population was especially vulnerable, and many of the villages of the Campagna were abandoned at this time. Malaria was thought to have been caused by a miasma emerging from the marshes, the malaria, or bad air. Local people no longer worked the land in the summer, and seasonal agricultural workers had to be imported in their thousands from other parts of Italy, some even kidnapped, pilgrims and children among them. They were appallingly treated by their overseers, and in the terrible conditions, many died, left where they fell to be eaten by dogs. Sorry about that. Meanwhile, Claude's wealthy patrons, several of whom owned large family estates in the Campagna that he evoked, resided in their palazzi in Rome for much of the year, safe from the worst effects of these climate-induced hardships. For this clique of aristocratic landowners, which included ancient baronial families and prominent churchmen, their ancestral estates were of vital importance to them, even if no longer very productive or lucrative. Although they generally leased them out to tenant farmers on a more or less feudal basis, and rarely visited them except to hunt or at Christmas, they had huge symbolic significance as the source of their titles, derived from ancient castles in the region. So these estates were in fact immensely valuable for the historic titles that went with them, and it was that connection with the classical past that Claude's paintings so purposefully celebrated. And if he needed to import trees into the denuded landscapes of reality, as it were, he could do so by studying specimens in the manufactured woods planted in the parks and vineyards of his patrons' villas that ringed the fringes of Rome, as with this drawing made on the spot in the Vigna Madama. Like any artist in history, to make a living, Claude had to produce what his patrons wanted, in this case, a beautiful fiction. There is some irony then that these fictional, idealised Claudian landscapes, which exerted such influence on landscape artists of his own day and of future generations, also inspired a whole fashion in actual landscape design, especially in this country, under designers like Lancelot Capability Brown, for example, and we think of gardens at Stowe, Petworth, Aldy End, and here, perhaps most famously, at Starhead, which only lacks the Claudian shepherds and shepherdesses. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. You need to introduce me. I'm happy to not be introduced. If that was the plan, sorry, I'm just too eager to get going.
I know, time is of the essence. Okay, Dr. Esther Chadwick is Senior Lecturer in Art History at the Courtauld. She was interested in 18th century image making in all its forms. Her research addresses the political agency of art in the age of revolutions. It's quite funny doing it with you there. The materiality of printed images, the visual culture of transatlantic enslavement, and cross-cultural artistic encounters. She is interested in the global context of British art and is currently working on the cultural connections between Britain and Haiti in the years after the Haitian Revolution.
Thank you. So hello again, and thanks to Chloe for organising this. Thank you to everyone for being here. We're now staying with the subject of landscape, and I'm the first in a double header because I'm going to talk about this picture and sort of just introduce us to what we're looking at and bring us into the picture before I then hand over to my colleague Steve Edwards, who's going to speak a little further about kind of where we are with Gainsborough and where Gainsborough studies might be going. So here we go. I'm sick of portraits and wish very much to take my viol de gamme and walk off to some sweet village where I can paint landscapes and enjoy the fag end of life in quietness and ease. I hate being confined in harness to follow the track whilst others ride in the wagon, undercover, stretching their legs in the straw at ease and gazing at green trees and blue skies without half my taste. Gainsborough's letter to his friend William Jackson, written in June of an unknown year, seems particularly pertinent to this work, The Harvest Wagon. There's an invitation in this famous paragraph about viols, landscapes, and the fag end of life to read the painting as some kind of personal allegory. Gainsborough, the portraitist, beholden to his fashionable patrons as a horse in harness, others of lesser ability having fun in the back. Maybe. In any case, this is certainly no ordinary landscape. The painting was first exhibited at the Society of Artists in London in 1767, but it remained unsold after exhibition. It was produced while Gainsborough was living in the fashionable spa town of Bath, and was eventually gifted by the artist to his friend and patron, a local gentleman named Walter Wiltshire. In fact, the painting's movement between Bath and London is pertinent. Wiltshire had established a successful business as a carrier, that is, in wagons, some flying, as in fast ones, carrying goods on a weekly basis between warehouses in the two cities, including Gainsborough's paintings, which he shipped to exhibitions and for delivery to London sitters. You get a sense of Wiltshire's vehicles from prints like these by Rowlandson and Pine. Gainsborough's friend, patron, and the first owner of the Barber Institute picture was a trustee of the Bath Turnpike Road. He was a haulier, the proprietor of Wiltshire's Flying Wagons. He was a man all about carriages, roads, transportation, Britain's burgeoning infrastructure. And I couldn't resist including this. Here is a detail from a satirical print showing him as a wagon. Along with this pendant on the left, Gainsborough gave the harvest wagon to Wiltshire, it is said, as the artist's token for the gift he had received from him of a grey horse, the very one, we're told by Gainsborough's early 20th century biographer William Whitley, that we see depicted in the harvest wagon's second focal point. So it may be no surprise that the beast, a favourite of Gainsborough's for riding, is endowed with such heroic energy, which Gainsborough achieves through the masterful deployment of a visual reference to the ancient Quirinal horse tamers. Indeed, what makes this and marks this painting out from the landscapes that had preceded it in Gainsborough's oeuvre is its deployment of grand art historical allusion, and centrally to Rubens. Gainsborough had copied, after Forstermann's engraving, Rubens' Descent from the Cross, and had likely also seen Rubens' own oil sketch or modello for the altarpiece at Corsham Court, the home of one of his other patrons, Paul Cobb-Methuen, and rather beautifully, that oil is now at the Courtauld. It's now in the Courtauld collection. We see how Gainsborough transposes the triangular composition and the push and pull of bodies for the central group in the harvest wagon, a miracle of assimilation, as the art historian John Hayes called it. In thus borrowing from the great Baroque master, Gainsborough stages a drama of the road. He presents the road as a human stage. I think there's an amazing project to be done about Gainsborough and roads, Gainsborough and infrastructure. That's the subject for another day. This is almost operatic, perhaps balletic even, in the handling of bodies and gestures. Ordinary rural labourers are elevated to the status of dramatis personae. Gainsborough invests them with a form of heroism, yes, but there is also drunkenness, wantonness, and looseness. Some have asked whether there may not be a parodic element in play. Drunken harvesters and the crucifixion, a shepherd girl for Christ, really? Scholars disagree also about whether these people are simply returning from a hard day's work in the field, or whether they might be on their way to the annual harvest feast. The occasion, according to whom you believe, as John Barrow put it, at which the essential solidarity of the English rural community is confirmed as landlord, tenant, and labourer sit together in a spontaneous celebration whose freedom is uninhibited by any obtrusive sense of social division, or, in another interpretation of that same feast, at which that division is aggressively confirmed by the knowledge of everyone present that this is a once-a-year occasion and that the labourer is being bribed by beer and frumenty to accept next day the same obligations and the same discipline at the hands of his masters as he has accepted throughout the grueling weeks of the harvest and throughout the whole year. Such ambivalence about the status of rural labourers in the social order is arguably matched at the level of picturing. Gainsborough quotes not just from Rubens, but also from Hogarth. Look at the figure holding the pitchfork in the corner of the cart, plying his sore head with a handkerchief. He comes straight from that tale of debauchery and dissipation, The Rake's Progress. This is the final scene in the series in which the young Tom Rakewell, having frittered away his inheritance on the pleasures of town, has ended up a lunatic in Bedlam Asylum. And note also, I hope you can just about see them, the two rakes in the cart itself. David Salkin has rightly noted that the painting is animated by a play between high and low, Baroque pathos on one hand, urban satire on the other. This is, he notes, a painting of mixed messages. Indeed, the whole work is shot through with tensions between speed and sluggishness, so the muscular horse, as opposed to the kind of hungover peasant, power and dissipation, the thrust of these figures here versus the slumping woman here, and blockage and passages, so fallen tree and the fence as kind of emblems of blockage, and yet these very dynamic swaying trees and this kind of sweeping road and the gap between the trees. When we look more closely at the figures, we notice further contradictions. The woman being hoisted up over the cart's huge back wheel has gold buckles on her shoes. What are they doing in this rutted road in the woods? In fact, the model for this figure, this woman here, is traditionally identified as the artist's daughter, Margaret, and the décolleté figure kneeling or swooning at left may be a portrait of his elder daughter, Mary. These are not farm girls, but society ladies in the early 1770s here, in a work probably painted when Gainsborough's family moved away from Bath to London. So how does our reading of the painting change when we know that it contains these family portraits? Returning to the idea of Gainsborough's landscapes as personal allegories, could we think of the cart as journeying into adulthood somehow? Even as they join their rural compatriots here, Mary and Margaret are moving further down the road of adult life, which will take them, paradoxically, far away from country pleasures. It would be unwise to fix on any single narrative meaning, I think, but the painter's identification of his own daughters with bawdy peasants cannot be explained away by the convenience of having them as his closest studio models. John Barrell argued that the reason the harvest wagon initially remained unsold may have had to do with the fact that its, as he put it, dynamic and earthy vision of the English peasantry was already becoming unacceptable by the late 1760s. He compares the Barber painting with a second version, now in Toronto, in which all that carnal energy is tamed. Seated women now tend their babies, the drinking keg is gone, the horses no longer rear up but stand patiently, one behind the other in a row. A domestication of the rural peasantry in representation that falls more easily into line with an emergent sense of the good poor, in which family values and virtuous industry come to the fore. But if this dynamic and earthy vision of the English peasantry seems to have faded in Gainsborough's later landscapes, I think we still need to grapple with the fact that he seems to have identified with it so closely by the image of his own family, his own daughters, in this one. So I'll now hand over to Steve.
Break the flow there. Professor Steve Edwards joined the Courtauld in April 2025 as Manton Professor of British Art and as Director of the newly established Manton Centre for British Art, which hosts conferences, workshops and research lectures. He began teaching at the University of Derby and has subsequently held professorships at the Open University, where he also was head of the Art History Department, and at Birkbeck, University of London.
Thank you, Chloe, and thank you for coming. I'm pleased, or semi-pleased, to have the opportunity to go out on a limb. Right. Okay. When I began studying art history in the early 1980s, interpretation of 18th century British landscape painting was an extremely dynamic field, perhaps only matched for its impact by the study of French Impressionism. David Salkin's Richard Wilson exhibition at Tate and the accompanying catalogue, John Barrell's Dark Side of the Landscape, and Anne Birmingham's Landscape and Ideology were all landmark studies that had a huge impact beyond their ostensible topics. It's worth recalling for a moment a time when an exhibition of 18th century art could provoke Apollo into accusing Salkin and Tate of serving the KGB, and when the British press, from the Telegraph to the Guardian and the Times Literary Supplement, could be stirred to defend Arcadian landscape painting. And they did. The emerging social historians of art adopted a new line of thinking, exploring British landscape painting in relationship to enclosure and the increase of rural class conflict. Centrally, they argued that landscape painters created a comforting image of rural order for their rich patrons. Something seems to have gone wrong with my talk. Okay. So one of there's something gone slightly wrong with what I've printed. But one of the things that happened is that these historians picked up on a particular argument from the final chapter of Volume 1 of Marx's Capital, in which Marx argued that that capitalism came into being through a series of very violent upheavals that included everything from the enslavement of Africans to driving the English rural classes from the agricultural land. That argument was picked up particularly by social historians like E.P. Thompson, but also other social historians who began to rewrite the history of the so-called agricultural revolution, looking at the process of enclosure that transformed the English landscape from an open field system to a system that was enclosed and privatised, so that the vast majority of the English land became private property, often enacted through Acts of Parliament. In the process, according to these historians, that a landless labouring class was produced, a class which had nothing to sell but its labour power. So the emerging social historians of art adopted that line of thinking, exploring British landscape painting in relationship to enclosure and the increase of rural class conflict that arose from it. Centrally, they argued that landscape painters created a comforting image of rural order for their rich patrons. The opening lines of Anne Birmingham's book state, "The emergence of rustic landscape painting as a major genre in England at the end of the 18th century coincide with the accelerated enclosure of the English countryside." In her account, Gainsborough presents a mythic ideal of independent labour, allowing landowners to avoid confronting the transformed conditions of rural work. In a particularly sophisticated account, John Barrell considered how the Virgilian traditions of pastoral and Georgic poetry were employed to create an image of British landscape centred on a fantasy of rural peace and social harmony. He argued that whereas pastoral poetry represents an ideal of harmonious rural idleness, Georgic introduces elements of rural work with the harshness of rural life mitigated by what he called ornate diction. For Barrell, Gainsborough balanced pastoral and Georgic themes in a way that allowed the Italianate shepherds that we saw in the talk about Claude and their milkmaids to be transformed into suitably British figures. While also at the same time, Barrell insists eradicating the more challenging elements of rural work and the rural situation. Let's call this lineage the landscape of enclosure. In these accounts, Gainsborough's landscape paintings occupy a prominent position. While drawing on the Netherlandish tradition, it is said, Gainsborough created a British landscape tradition sufficiently distant from Wilson's patrician Arcadia or Claude's Roman Campagna, while avoiding or occluding the profound changes that were taking place in the countryside. Barrow was able to find tension or contradictory energies in these pictures, but on the whole, critical art historians presented his endeavour as a myth-making project centred on a conception of rural harmony likely to please wealthy gentlemen. Discussion has largely stayed there for some time, except for an important chapter in Michael Rosenthal's 1999 book, The Art of Thomas Gainsborough. Except for that chapter, recent research has either added very little or focused on other aspects of his work, particularly metropolitan portraiture. It's interesting to note that eco-criticism hasn't really got round to thinking about Gainsborough yet. I'm not certain about what I'm going to suggest, but I think we can now position Gainsborough differently. In 1990, the Midnight Notes Collective published a special issue of their journal called The New Enclosures, which sparked a huge debate. Their editorial suggested a corrosive secret is hidden in the gleaming idols of globalism. Their editorial, the last decade, they said, has seen the largest enclosure of the worldly commons in history. The central point was that the enclosure was not a one-off big bang at the origin of capitalism, but a permanent condition of competitive accumulation driven by block development and indebtedness. Tens of thousands were being driven off the land in Africa in a process often fueled by the IMF and structural adjustment. In China, 100 million have been displaced from common lands. In the West, state resources have been privatised, and everywhere nature is being devastated. The results have been dispossession on a planetary scale, with increased global warming and species extinction in its tow. The environmental commentator, Rob Nixon, characterises the effects as a form of slow violence against people and nature. In this context, commoning has again come into focus as a figure for a different kind of world that values more than personal gain and individualism. After all, what is the atmosphere but a commons? This is a huge debate, but thinking about it again has led me to reassess Gainsborough's landscape work. It's not that Barrow and the other commentators are wrong, but I think that there's another way of seeing these extraordinary pictures. For those familiar with contemporary art history, what I have in mind is akin to T.J. Clarke's Heaven on Earth, where Clarke draws on the medieval tale of the land of cocaine to read Arcadian painting from below, finding in the imagery of idleness a popular conception of escape from unremitting toil. Rather than mere fantasy, the works Clarke discusses emerge as prefigurative image of utopian possibility. Ernst Bloch would call them wish images. In this light, Gainsborough's landscapes can be seen not simply as images of enclosure, but predominantly, I think, as landscapes of commoning, and particularly of forest commoning. Gainsborough, in fact, rarely depicts enclosed land, opting for his own imaginative version of the forest commons. Only Rosenthal seems to have noticed this. Throughout these landscapes, figures chop and collect wood, as they were legally allowed to do. Look at the return, or the cottage door, and ask what those figures carrying bundles of sticks represent. They're exercising the customary common rights of turbary or estovers, the right to collect fallen wood or fuel for building repair. The market cart, and I think this is here, the market cart of 1786 to 7 centres on commerce, but there is yet again a figure collecting wood. Even the landscapes featuring industriousness, such as the early and ungainly forest Connaught Wood in Tate, in the National Gallery, prominently includes an act of commoning. And incidentally in this picture, the fiddle in the mid-ground with a spade may also be exercising customary right, rather than engaging in the labour for another. I don't want to minimise the Tory ideal at stake here, but this is very far from the vision embodied in George Stubbs's Reapers of 1784, with its focus on neatness, industry, order and hierarchy. At last, this brings me to the harvest wagon, which, as several historians and Esther have already suggested, is a very odd picture. One that depicts popular life, yet is laden with erudite references. As we've seen, the central composition seems to be derived from Rubens' Descent from the Cross. It contains quotations from classical sculpture, from Raphael's Fire in the Borgo, from Hogarth's Rake's Progress. And the pun, I think, is very evident. In this way, some commentators see it as contradictory, or worse, a model compiled from distinct, unsynthesized elements. The cart is the site of licentiousness, raucous male drinking, and at least a suggestion of sexual abandon. But as some authors have observed, the woman being hoisted into the cart is very well dressed, and as Esther has pointed out, she may be a portrait of Gainsborough's daughter. Perhaps because of these oppositions, high and low, popular and elite, the picture conveys a particular sense of energy. In fact, I want to suggest it occupies a space between heaven and earth. Among his generation of artists, we should recall that Gainsborough was an unusually observant Christian. The Descent from the Cross is one indication of this in-betweenness, but the composition also seems to pull in the opposite direction. As Barrow observes, Rubens' composition has been redirected so that the composition points emphatically upward. The upper section of Gainsborough's picture appears to take off or to soar. Less noticed, though, the lower elements emphasize their groundedness. The fallen tree trunk in the foreground calls attention to its very weight, and is often the case with Gainsborough. Quadrupeds accentuate the planted contact with the earth, their very four-footedness stressing their groundedness. As much as it brings the lowly into contact with the high-flown references, the harvest wagon is pulled in different directions, rising ethereally to free itself from material tethering, yet it remains earthbound. The cart is located at the site of these tensions between the compositional forces, and perhaps that's the point. The contradictions generate the small, bounded world that seems momentarily free from labour and its restrictions. As we have seen, there is some disagreement about Barrow's suggestion that these disorderly revellers are on their way to a harvest supper, the celebratory meal that marks the end of agricultural harvest and which has had its origins in pagan festivals. However, from my perspective, it's a helpful suggestion, making this a compelling image of commoners and their moral economy. This earthly vision would soon be displaced by mere domestic homilies, so I think it's worth hanging on to its vital energy as an image against the slow violence of enclosure then and now. Thank you.
Matthew French is a final year doctoral student at the University of Birmingham. He is currently preparing a thesis on the artist Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, titled Toulouse-Lautrec, Caricature and the Marketing of Modern Art, which considers the ways in which caricature proliferated at the end of the century, notably in the work of Toulouse-Lautrec. He is also preparing a major exhibition on the artist to take place in 2029 at major London and European galleries. Matthew is co-founder of the ECR French Art Network, a research network for early career scholars.
Thank you.
There we go. Well, thank you, Chloe, first of all, and then the technical research forum team who have saved us, and you for braving the decidedly autumn weather. This sort of talk is going to be decidedly more informal than those that have come before, but it's the beginnings, the germ of a 5-year major exhibition project. And it's quite nice, quite fitting that I'm here because I'm a PhD student at the Barber in Birmingham, and also you might see me launching at the ticket desk at the Courtauld at the weekend, so it's sort of two worlds collide, which is rather nice. So you may remember back in May, a long time ago, for a very brief time, we had 4 Toulouse-Lautrec up in the gallery, and 4 that are quite representative of the artist's sort of very short career. And it gives us an opportunity to assess his sort of 4 key periods and his stylistic change over about 10 or so years. But yes, I think what they demonstrated is Toulouse-Lautrec's interest in the model, and that is the basis of the exhibition project, which is looking at Toulouse-Lautrec, the artist, and his models. So what we have on the first one is sort of in the Barber picture, the artist model. We have 2 celebrities in the middle, and then sort of a courtesan playing sort of a popular socialite at the end. And they represent different sort of spheres of Toulouse-Lautrec's social circle and its evolution across 10 or so years. And I like to think of the quote of his friend Gustave Coqueriot, who wrote that he will seek to cherish his models more. He will consume a fiercer will to draw them better, to paint them with more ardour, more love. And that's been sort of the basis of our very early thoughts. So I'm going to use the Barber painting as sort of, hopefully just to sketch a few ideas to it and place it in its context and look at some great images on the way. But it's sort of the germ of how we might think about his artistic practice and how important the role of the figure, the model, was in his career, but also in his own personal life. And the whole sort of point is to try and sort of debunk sort of myths of the artist and the sort of lecherous slouch, sort of getting drunk in Montmartre, which plagues the literature, but trying to look at a more gentler human side to the artist. So the project runs parallel to my doctoral research, which I'm due to finish very soon, so sort of numerous sleepless nights at the minute, which looks at the artist's use of caricature, its proliferation across media, across different sites of consumption. So we've got posters, paintings, and other things there. So just briefly with the Barber painting, that's the best picture I could get on the left, so apologies, but that's my own on the right, which sort of gives a sense of the sort of the textures and the detail. So it's a purchase from Arthur Tooth and Son, sort of a well-known London gallery in 1848 to join the collection for a sum of 3,800. But it also provides an opportunity for us to tell a different story about Toulouse-Lautrec, and one that I hope the exhibition will eventually convey. But looking at it and thinking about what we've got, as the title suggests, it is just a woman seated in the garden. Behind we have sort of thinned paint layers, so it's using a oil paint that's been sort of distilled down in an essence. We've got the hint of buildings sort of towards the back up here, I think. It's sort of very hard to work out, but there's lots of vegetation, there's sort of bunches of trees there, sort of the hint of sort of a prefabricated building. And she sits rather awkwardly in rather sort of rudimentary chair and an empty table. But in comparison, and I think the image on the right brings it out, comparison to the background, the detail, Toulouse-Lautrec's attention is devoted to the physiognomy, to representing the face, sort of a real interest. And I really urge you, when you do go to the gallery, to really sort of get up close to this and really look at it. And there's real interest in sort of the ear, the nose, and the wonderful textures of the skin that he's conveyed there. So the work falls into a body of about 20 paintings that were painted sort of across sort of 1890, 1891 in the summer of each of those years, of about 20 portraits of, well, all but one of women sort of set in the garden. So some of the sitters are known to us. Here's the Gabrielle, which was the dancer, and she does appear in the Oscar Reinhardt picture, if I can go back. That's her there, who was the partner of this clown. So sort of lots of networks and things. There's Carmen Gourdin, which is one of his most popular models. We have Honoré Platzner in this picture from the Orsay. But again, he's using the same sort of technique. It's the same range of colours, a brilliant and rapid technique with the oil paint diluted in turpentine, and they're all done on card. But yet I think they all show his interest in figures, in the person, and the sort of the background becomes very much secondary here. So all these works were painted in the garden of Monsieur Fauré, and I do love these pictures of the artist actually at work, and you can see him in the summer. And this is a painting that's now in the Pushkin. And coincidentally, actually, this is another thing of the project. You sort of have a tendency to notice sort of little details like the chair, which is the same as this one here, and chairs and things will become you become rather fixated on them at the minute. But so the Garden Monsieur Fauré was essentially just a wasteland. They practiced archery there, played games, and it was a sort of a social space. And here we get Toulouse-Lautrec working out of doors on probably a hot Parisian day. And here's its location. It's, if anyone knows Montmartre, here's the cemetery. We have the Moulin de Galette somewhere up here. There's the artist studio. It's in these top windows here. And so it would have been a little trot down to the garden, which is now where that sort of concrete monstrosity of a casino is, and a car park, and a sort of a cheap hotel. And here's the studio of, well, the apartment of Theo and Vincent van Gogh. So Toulouse-Lautrec would often just traipse up this little hill and go and hang out. And there's some decidedly nice letters and anecdotes of them getting quite drunk, I think. It's fun. But keep that studio in mind, because we shall sort of see. So just thinking about the painting, it remained unsold during Lautrec's lifetime, but entered in the collection of, here we go, here's the sort of range of collectors, a collector called Sauvagien, under the title of Saint-Just, which still remains on the frame of the painting, which sort of means pensive, reflective, lost in thought in French. And it follows sort of many of Toulouse-Lautrec paintings that were of types, of moods that were either labelled during his lifetime or posthumously. But another area of new research that I'm sort of thinking about, this is just a page from the catalogue of in 1920, is just the range of collectors, the sort of the life this has after it's been painted. And it appeared in Sauvagien's collection, which was sold in 1920, alongside some of these lovely works. I mean, at the Moulin Rouge is just a sort of a monumental canvas. And again, we have this figure who appeared again, he's the proprietor of the Moulin Rouge, appeared in the Oscar Reinhardt painting. So we're sort of going around and around. And I think there's the artist's father just over there in the far end. But the two paintings in the bottom left, again, they went on to the next collector, John Quinn, in New York. And then it ended up in the, I don't know what I'm pressing here, in the collection of a socialite, so Audrey Playdel-Bouverie. And here she is, this is a page from her sort of scrapbook of who's who. So we've got Salvador Dali, Coco Chanel, and Misha Serre at the top left. And so previously, so Toulouse-Lautrec would have known her as Misha Natanson, who was the husband of Thérèse Natanson, who edited the journal La Revue Blanche. And so there we've sort of got, again, these lovely connections that run through the painting's life. But I want to draw attention a little bit to this quote from when the painting was shown at a French exhibition at the National Gallery during the war in '43. And it says, "It is pleasant to reflect that Toulouse-Lautrec should not be present in that café concert aspect of his life, which one feels has been worked almost to death." Feel that these days too, I think. Admirers of this great master know how to appreciate a work such as such quiet distinction and charm as La Saint-Just, painted about 1890. So it's with that in mind that sort of we want to think a little bit more about, you know, move away beyond the Montmartre party life that a lot of exhibitions have been focused upon. And so so this is very early, you know, in the exhibition's germ, but part of it is trying to think about who might these individuals be, what their relationship to Toulouse-Lautrec, how they worked, how you represent them across different media in different contexts. And so here's, you know, sort of me and the curatorial team are sort of trying to work out, can we identify figures? These are all just hypotheses, but these sort of were painted at roughly the same date. So it's, yeah, we're sort of trying to think about the people themselves. So again, this is sort of can be done with lots of other work. So here we are with that, the Moulin Rouge, and here's the same model in an Anquetin pastel that's at Tate. You can just sort of see that there's sort of an economy of looking at the same model, using the same model between artists. And Anquetin was a contemporary of Toulouse-Lautrec. They exhibited together, they ran, they went off and had a great time in Amsterdam, as the sort of letters attest to. But again, we tried to think about, again, we're going back to the studio here, which I pointed at, and thinking about the artist's work in the studio. And we've got 4 paintings that sort of follow the same sort of theme, the germ of the Barber collector, of looking at the artist's model. And here we are in the studio of Toulouse-Lautrec, the portrait of his mother. Again, you start fixating on chairs and things. It's the same chair. So we're sort of looking at sort of the composition, the compositional ideas he was having, the various individuals he was looking at. And here we are again, so it's the same model across 3 different artists. Well, her name was Louise Hortense Bois-Guillaumin, and she was depicted here by Roussinot and Casas, who were both living up in Montmartre. And there's a whole, these are sort of very new sort of discoveries and ideas, and the whole plan of the project is to try and ascertain who these people were and their relationship to these artists. Again, here we are, Carmen Gaudin, who's going to be a huge focus of the exhibition. She's in the garden of Monsieur Fauré again. There's again the chair. You become fixated on chairs doing this. Here she is in the studio looking out the window, but playing this type, so La Blanchisseuse, so the washer, the laundry person. And I just love how, I know these are all just very fantastic works, but they show a real, sort of evolution of style over a very quick period of time. And then just closing, just very quick, a brief run through. Again, we're going to be sort of looking at some of the male portraits, which are again represented in the artist's studio. Again, we've got sort of these chairs, and then there's this portrait of Monsieur Delaporte at the Jardin de Paris, but again, we could tell it's sort of a bit of a fiction because of the portrait. So it's a sort of a studio portrait that's been imbued with extra meaning. So as you can tell, it's a very early project, and I think the whole point here is just to think of how the collection is making us think ever so slightly differently and trying to think outside the box with sort of Toulouse-Lautrec. But I think, the Barber picture sort of opens up some new areas of research. So that's sort of the collectors that took on the painting after, the hands that it changed, what it was exhibited alongside, and that's something that's really not been looked at, and it's, there's lots of leg room there for some really good research to be done. But also we'll think about the individual model. Who might they be? How might they be represented across media? We could think about setting, the studio or the garden studio. Because I say you become sort of fixated on chairs. But yeah, I just hope that it's still very early days, and this is it's going to be another 5-year project. But just try and convey that the collection really is going to stimulate lots of really good future research on the artist. So thank you all. We've got to get out now.
Thank you very much. Okay, our last of the short presentations. Dr. Camilla Smith is Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Birmingham. She has published widely on German modernism, particularly on art and visual culture of the Weimar Republic. Her book, Jean Maman, Art Between Resistance and Conformity in Modern Germany, 1916 to 1950, explores gender and artistic dissent under National Socialism. A co-edited volume of essays with Ty Vanover, Erotic Art in Modern Germany, Visual Cultures of Sex, 1871 to 1945, is forthcoming with Bloomsbury in 2026. She is co-editor of the book series German Visual Culture with publisher Peter Lang. Camilla is the curator of 2 upcoming exhibitions, the first at the Barber Institute of Fine Arts in Birmingham on the artists Lotte Laserstein and René Sintenis, and a second at the Museum of Sex in New York on Weimar erotic visual culture. 50s.
Thank you so much for the invitation this evening. I've really enjoyed listening to all your research. Okay, let's get going. In the summer of 1913, the expressionist artist Max Pechstein told a friend the next winter would be his last in Berlin. He claimed, and I quote, "Berlin devours too much. I do not have the ambition to play a role anymore. To work, yes, but for that I need to be close to nature, which I cannot be here on the tarmac of the streets, which use up too much energy." Some months later, in May 1914, Pechstein would have his wish. The artist and his wife, Lotte, you see on the screen, travelled to the South Seas, to the island of Palau. They set off with 28 boxes, 2 shotguns, and left a very young son behind them. But before this, the artist would of course need to raise some funds, and that meant establishing himself in Berlin's thriving art scene, into which he launched himself with the utmost force. Produced some months before the couple left, Still Life in Grey already reveals some of Pechstein's longing for nature. By this point, the artist had already lived in Berlin for almost 6 years. The large composition depicts a still life of fruit and vegetables. Lemons and apples and a cauliflower, bizarrely, have been arranged on a Cameroonian stool in the centre of the painting. Several of the apples have, I suppose you might say, escaped and lie on the ground on a blue tapestry into which faces are woven, which in turn I think are evocative of sort of totemic masks. Carved around the stool is the repeated frieze of a stylised crouching woman, arms held aloft with a cat beneath her. To the right stands a blue and white vase bearing a design typical to that of pottery from Saxony, the area in eastern Germany where Pechstein was born. On the left, part of a table draped in pink cloth appears to slope away. Behind the stool and vase is another partial image of a female figure, I hope you can see that, wearing a pink dress, a frieze, or a mural perhaps. I'm going to come back to that idea. The shortened perspective pushes the objects forward, inviting the viewer in. Pechstein used extra turpentine to dilute the colours, allowing for rapid broad brushstrokes and bold sketchiness over much of the painting's surface. There is an intense, it's really difficult to kind of get this in a representation. When you see it, there's an intense luminosity to the work. The greens of the cauliflower leaves and lemons are offset by the colour of the apples. Over the course of 1912 to 13, Pechstein painted many still lifes like this one. The cauliflower, an unusual inclusion for a still life, and used perhaps for this formal reason. These works served as careful experiments in colour and composition, in which the important drive towards emotional experience and expressiveness instead of the traditional painterly truth to nature were paramount. In many ways, then, Still Life in Grey reveals the artist's close ties to the German expressionist artist group Die Brücke, or the Bridge, which had formed some years earlier in 1905 in Dresden. In 1906, this small group of artists, Fritz Lyell, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, Erich Heckel, and Karl Schmidt-Rottluff, asked Pechstein to join them. The group also worked together in the studio. You see some examples on the screen, arranging objects for still lives that defied our academic conventions. By 1912, Die Brücke had had their first major exhibition of works in Berlin, yet later the same year the group split. The group regarded Pechstein and his increasing success in the city with caution, perhaps even envy, and they were particularly unhappy about his entry into the Berlin Secession, an exhibiting society which represented many well-established impressionist-inspired artists, such as Max Liebermann and Lovis Courtauld. The Berlin Secession had, in fact, previously rejected works submitted by members of Die Brücke, the style that they deemed was far too radical and raw. Rather than them using some of the bright, acidic, one might say, colours characteristic of Die Brücke works, Still Life in Grey begins, I think then, to reveal how the artist was already moving away from the group. His unusual use of what appears to be a grey ground to prime the canvas, visible through I'd say the weave of the tapestry, potentially also informed the title of the work. Yet Still Life in Grey is far more than simply formal experimentation. It reveals the imperial grab for land in the South Pacific and West Africa, and demonstrates the popularity for the collecting of ethnographic objects during the period in both French and German empires. The German acquisition of Palau and Samoa in 1899 quickly transferred into subjects of artistic fascination. Even before this, collections of ethnographic objects began to be amassed in museums in both Dresden and Berlin, and we know Pechstein knew these collections. Pechstein was particularly captivated by clubhouses and architecture from Palau in one of the rooms in Dresden's Ethnographic Museum, and claimed that the storytelling from the roof beams and cross beams of Palau houses, you see one on the screen, I quote, instilled in me a longing as if I had already anticipated this distant tropical land. It became fashionable to collect ethnographic objects and exhibit them in the home as a statement of cultural avant-gardism. Die Brücke artists too used such objects arranged in their studio as important subject matter in their artworks. Whether Pechstein's fascination with the South Pacific and West Africa was necessarily generated by pro-colonial sentiments is less clear-cut, however, and that's a whole different story. Certainly, like many contemporaries, he appears to have been entirely taken in by the German media's widespread peddling of such places as a new paradise. Cultural developments in France played a huge role in further inspiring such fascination for German artists. The discovery of African sculpture was crucial to the work of Pablo Picasso, Henri Matisse, and André Derain. 1907 also saw the German translation of parts of Paul Gauguin's autobiographical and highly problematic account of Tahiti, Noah as a type of untarnished paradise. In 1908, Pechstein had himself spent a year in Paris, as all modern artists aspired to do in this period, soaking up the sights and the sounds of the city. Pechstein visited the Louvre and the Salon des Dépendants, where he encountered for himself the works of Matisse, Braque, Munch and Derain. Indeed, it was at this moment that Braque and Picasso were experimenting with Cubism, and Pechstein rented a studio near the Bohemian Montparnasse neighbourhood. The formative influence of the French avant-garde on Still Life in Grey, the shortened perspective, the experiments with object and space, is clearly palpable. Back in Berlin in 1913, when Still Life in Grey was produced, Pechstein's reputation was growing. In February, he held his first solar exhibition at the renowned commercial art gallery of Wolfgang Gurlitt. It was both a commercial and critical success. Ada, the wife of Brücke artist Emil Nolde, claimed shortly after the exhibition opening, "Soon he will be the crowned favourite of the Berliners." Showing work at Gallery Gurlitt was a big deal. Wolfgang Gurlitt, and yes, he is related to Hildebrand Gurlitt and Cornelius Gurlitt, you probably know the big hoard of Nazi art that was discovered in 2013. Wolfgang Gurlitt then had great success in the city, capitalising on his father, the art dealer Fritz Gurlitt, by showing French and German modernism. Gurlitt's commercial rival, Paul Cassirer, had held the first solar exhibition of Cézanne's work in Berlin in 1912. We know that Pechstein saw it. During this period, Pechstein was also busy working on some of the lavish renovations of Wolfgang Gurlitt's apartment, which was also the gallery. His dealership was situated in the same building. Pechstein then designed wall mosaics in the hallway, as well as stained glass windows you see on the screen. The renovations caused a sensation in the press. Pechstein's paintings also hung prominently on the wall of Gurlitt's study, and above, two Cameroonian stools that are similar, I think, to the ones depicted in Still Life in Grey. Perhaps then, my contention, Pechstein had conceived his still life with Gurlitt as a buyer in mind. Moreover, the painting also advertises the artist's long-standing preoccupation with interior design. Born and raised in Zwickau, Pechstein had been apprenticed as a young man to a painter and decorator. In the School of Applied Arts in Dresden, Pechstein developed his skill in all different departments: furniture design, textiles, interior design, sculpture, and commercial decorative painting. And perhaps unsurprisingly, he excelled in all of them. Despite focusing primarily on his skills as a painter for much of his career, and I guess that's how we really know him, Pechstein did not relinquish his attitude and passion for design. He was a practical and commercially minded man and dismissed the idea that the best type of art was produced by impoverished artists who suffered for their profession. He said it was kind of total nonsense. In addition to Gurlitt's house, then you see on the screen, Pechstein also completed murals for the dining room of the civil servant and art collector Hugo Perls between 1911 and 12. Perls' house symbolised the epitome of modernism and was designed by the architect Mies van der Rohe. For his murals, Pechstein depicted a series of dynamic figures in nature, dancing, sitting and bathing. The angularity and rhythmical composition of the figures as the scene stretches across the walls is akin perhaps to the partial figurative image of the woman in pink seen in the background of Still Life in Grey. Could this too then be part of a mural? So it's my contention then that Still Life in Grey acts like an artist's calling card, or a resume if you will, of an artist who wished to show the Berlin art market of what he was capable. A painter, yes, but also a creator of murals, textiles, who had a profound understanding of the decorative and interior spaces. Wolfgang Gurlitt was impressed. In fact, before leaving for Palau, Pechstein entered a financial contract with Gurlitt, who, it was agreed, would act as the sole commercial representative of the artist's work and pay him a monthly salary. It was to be a contract that Pechstein would later learn to regret and ultimately saw them end up in court. Nonetheless, it was Gurlitt who subsidised Pechstein's travels, hoping they would inspire new work. And until 1922, this contract remained in place. Indeed, it became particularly useful during the First World War when Gurlitt was able to sell the artist's works in his absence and send the money to his wife. In 1917, Still Life in Grey was exhibited in Leipzig, and it's likely to have been sold there too. The art historian Karl Lilienfeld, who was then the head of the modern art section at Leipzig Kunstverein, bought it. When the Lilienfeld family later emigrated to the United States, the work was exhibited in their gallery in New York. Still Life in Grey did not return to Germany until much later. It was not, I think quite importantly, one of the 16 Pechstein works that was exhibited in the Degenerate Art Exhibition that opened in Munich in 1937. My final slide. In the Barber Institute then, the Still Life in Grey has found a perfect new home, along with many modernist works by fellow Berlin secessionists Lovis Courtauld and also André Dernat and Paul Gauguin, whose works played such a formative role in inspiring Pechstein's own painting. In more recent times, Pechstein's work has rather fallen out of favour, with expressionist contemporaries such as Ernst Ludwig Kirchner garnering far more attention. There are a few Pechstein works in the UK, although I would say that Manchester has quite a supreme example of a double-sided painting. I very much hope then, or it's very much hoped, that Still Life in Grey will help shine the spotlight back onto this artist for audiences in the UK in its new home in the Barber. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to all our speakers who very valiantly took up the 10-minute challenge, which was very difficult to do, so thank you all. I think in the interest of time, we may have to take the possibly unpopular decision not to go to questions right now, but to turn to Mark and Jenny, who are going to speak at 15, 20 minutes, something like that. Whatever you were planning on doing is good. And then we're going to have drinks afterwards, just down the hallway. And please do ask your questions then, because I'm sure you have them. I'm sorry that we haven't, in the end, got time to go to you. But yes, over to you.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. And what we thought we would do is say a few words about the origins of our two institutions and a few very brief reflections on those origins. And then maybe spend a few minutes, and we won't take up too much time, on the history of the collection and the character of the collections, and then end with a few words about the ways in which we're taking our institutions forward and the kind of plans we've got to take both the Barber and the Courtauld forward. And I was just reflecting as I was sitting listening to these wonderful talks that we've been listening to and reflecting on a range of different kinds of work that we've been looking at and the different approaches we've been listening to, on how that compares with what would have been the equivalent of the Research Forum programme for the autumn of 1932, which was the first autumn of the Courtauld's existence as a teaching institution. And what I was really excited to find in doing a bit of preparation for this talk is there's the lecture list for the first autumn of the Courtauld's existence in the autumn of 1932, when it just opened its activities at Home House in Peltman Square. And on the one hand, this is an incredibly disappointing list in the sense, or not disappointing, but in the sense, or characteristic and problematically characteristic list of lectures from the time, in the sense that not a single of the lecturers listed there as a woman. It's entirely male. On the other hand, in lots of ways, it's actually doing an extraordinary, ambitious, interesting, and in many ways, a programme of activity that isn't a million miles away, and I'm not sure if this is a disappointing or an exciting aspect from what we're doing today. We have one of the leading art historians and critics of the period, Roger Fry, giving a series of talks. And then amongst all the subjects that are listed there, we not only have John Constable in English Landscape, which offers a nice echo to the things we've been listening to tonight by Sir Giles Holmes, but also talk series on Romanesque art, Byzantine art, Celtic and Viking art. And then as we look towards the bottom, Chinese and Japanese art, a course in Buddhist sculpture in China, a course on principles of criticism. And so what's also interesting is looking at that list of courses and talks and seeing that as well as being geared to the students of the Courtauld, lectures marked with 1 asterisk, a limited number of tickets are available for the public. And then if there are 2 asterisks listed against the talks, then those are talks that are available to the public for free. So there's a really interesting sense of what the kind of character of the Courtauld was at its inception, and how actually that character of a very mixed economy of talks that are geared both to students but also to a broader public, and actually ranging very widely across an extraordinary array of different topics and regions and periods, including courses and talks on works or artists featured in the collection, including a talk on Manet on November the 21st, that autumn, were characteristic of the Courtauld right at its beginning. So this gives you a sense of the academic ambition and range and programme of the Courtauld at its inception. And the second slide I just wanted to show you briefly is something that kind of sits quite happily alongside, or interestingly alongside that first programme, which is a catalogue of the works, of the pictures and the works at Home House, published in 1935. And this text, which opens up that catalogue, it's a small hand-printed catalogue, shows not only that the range of works, which include many of the works that we still see hanging today, these were all distributed around Home House. So the students were studying amongst these works and had the chance not only to appreciate them as in and around their studies, but also had the chance, as it says there, to enjoy works that were on display by a number of living artists, which is quite an interesting thing. We don't tend to think of the Courtauld as a space for contemporary art. But at that point, they just received the collection from Roger Fry's bequest, which was in a single room, and there were works by living artists as well as these familiar artists to us on display, and that the house is open free to the public on Saturdays. So at that point, the gallery aspect of what the Courtauld was something available to the public on Saturdays, but then not much broader than that. So that, I hope, just gives you a flavour of the Courtauld, both as a gallery space and an exhibition space, and also as a teaching institution right at its beginnings. And I wondered how that compared with the Barber, Jenny.
I'm just going to go back to your slide here, Mark. Can you hear me? Is that okay?
Yes.
Because when Mark sent me this, we both went into our archives in preparation for today. We also noticed that the person talking about Manet in this 1932 series is Bodkin, who was the first director of the Barber, which is fascinating because Bodkin was still in Ireland at this point, working at the National Gallery there. And they were, he was obviously closely connected with the Courtauld already. Constable was also, interestingly, one of his referees for his interview.
Constable was the first director of the Courtauld.
Yeah, at the Barber. So there were these interesting connections that predated actually the foundation of both of the institutions, really. And this 1932 was the year in which our deed was founded, but Bodkin wasn't really engaged in the Barber at that time. So that was quite an exciting discovery. And then this is credit to Robert here, who found this I got rather excited about this Times article here. And I got excited about it because recently we've been doing quite a lot of work thinking about what Lady Barber actually wrote in her deed of purpose when she constituted the Barber Institute. And it's quite light in what it says, really, in terms of information. So she described it as a place that should be for the study and encouragement of art and music. She makes a statement about it being a social space. And if you read it in finer detail, you can kind of pick out words like space to connect. But there isn't much more. And I think this is really interesting because it's from 1939, which was the year in which the building actually opened. And rather than the Barber being described as a museum or a gallery, it's described as a cultural centre. And I think that is a really important distinction for the Barber, that it really was conceived as an arts centre in a much broader sense, and one in which disciplines should be brought together for the benefit of multidisciplinary study. So in contrast to the Courtauld, where the subject of art history has always been absolutely at its core, the Barber, I think, was conceived as a space in which art history could be studied by all students of the university and the wider public in a kind of cross-disciplinary manner, and that it wasn't actually just concerned with a visual, it was very much concerned with music, and that is at its heart in terms of the deed, but also physically within the building, and it extends to law as well. So a number of the professorships that were set up through the Deed of Trust included the Director of Arts, the Director of Music, and also a law fellowship. So this description, which I won't read because we haven't got time, also mentions the Courtauld and in the distinction between the two. If you read on, and it's not here, the commentator says that the Barber is there for all and sundry. So I think even though Bodkin originally did lecture at the Barber as well, so there were public lectures and he did do some undergraduate teaching, really from the very beginning this was a very much a public and civic space. And the fact that that was constituted in Birmingham was not a mistake, because the university had already declared itself to be a civic space for the city, and that is still part of its own constitution and sort of mission. So
yeah, so an interesting distinction in lots of ways between the two institutions, and I guess it would be interesting then also to talk about the ways in which the collection evolved. And the Courtauld, of course, built on the gift by Samuel Courtauld of the collection that he and his wife had amassed over the 1920s in particular, and gifted to the new institute that he also was involved in founding. And it's worth saying that although this is an institute that bears his name, the person who seems to have come up with the idea for the Courtauld Institute of Art was Viscount Lee of Fareham, and has suggested that the need in Britain for an art institute, an art historical institute of the kind that did finally emerge, but that was one that he clearly saw needed funding. And Courtauld, hearing about this project and having the resources to be able to fund it, volunteered to do so, and then of course gave the gift of the collection as part of that initiative. But it seemingly, interestingly, suggested that it should be called the Lee Institute of Art, but then Viscount Lee himself said, no, you've been funding it. Philanthropy wins out, naming rights win out, as it were, and very modestly and generously said, no, this should be the Courtauld Institute of Art. And the third figure, of course, was Robert Witt, who helped donate the really amazing collection of both drawings and archival photographic materials to the Courtauld. But since then, and as all of those who might know the Courtauld well will know, that the Courtauld has become a collection of collections, and over time has grown through the gifts and bequests of a series of really major collectors and friends of the Courtauld, both large and small. And I was really, again, reading for today and for this evening, recognising that there are a number of smaller gifts to the Courtauld that have really been important, not necessarily the really famous large-scale ones, people like Antoine Zeilen and Gambier Parry gave, that have helped make the collection what it is today. And so it is a collection of collections, really much, which has been built not through an acquisitions budget, but through bequests and gifts over its history. And the other thing to mention, that this dual identity we have as both an art historical and conservation institute and a gallery has been one that, in terms of how we physically sort of laid out and been organised as an institution, has been a very interesting movement whereby for a long period, the home house provided the home both for the gallery and for the pictures on the one hand, and for the studies of the students, and neighbouring properties did that too. But then in 1958, of course, the Courtauld collection and galleries moved to Woburn Square. So for 30 years, the Institute and the gallery were separate, reunited once more in the late 1980s at Somerset House, of course, and then once again split in recent years between here, Vernon Square, and Somerset House, with the vision that we'll be reunited again. So the whole history of the Courtauld and its relationship between the gallery and institute has been one in which has seen those two parts of the equation kind of coming together and then splitting apart and hopefully coming back again together in a few years' time.
That's also interesting because we were just talking earlier with some of the colleagues that the History of Art department at Birmingham wasn't actually founded until the late Professor Richard Verdi essentially established it as a department of subject specialist study, and that was in 1990, we think. So it's quite a lot later, but since then, you know, in the same way that the Courtauld's identity has been created through the collaborative and dialogues that exist between collections, curators, public-facing programmes and academic research, we still retain that now, and that's core to us. I was just thinking, Mark, there, when you started, you were saying how actually there was a lot of contemporary art on show, or art by living artists on show when the Courtauld was established. So I wondered about how that is now borne out through your acquisition strategy or the collection. Is that something that you're kind of reflecting on?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of our current plans and our current initiatives, and our plans for the reuniting of the students and our faculty and the curatorial team and our galleries in 2029, which is our plan. Part of the thinking around the new Courtauld, the new campus that we'll be generating, will be a really important new focus on contemporary art. And we're really excited about the prospect of 2 new contemporary gallery spaces as part of the new campus that will be located in the east wing of Somerset House, and that will be overseen by our colleague Elena Kripper, but that will offer a complement to and a continuation of the shows that already focus on contemporary artists. We've got a show next year on Salman Tour. We've had recent shows on Claudette Johnson, Peter Doig. So there is an increasing focus on the contemporary, but really one that sees the contemporary in dialogue with and engaging with that art historical tradition that's also so much part of our displays and our exhibition programme. So we hope, the idea is that the students and visitors will be able to come to the Courtauld in the future and encounter some of those really early works that have been donated to us by collectors like Gambier Parry and Kaz Island, but also have the chance to engage with contemporary works as well. It's a very important part of the strategy now.
I think we're coming close together again in that sense. So I might just say a few brief things about the Barb's collection. It's very different in terms of its foundations, although interestingly, as this exhibition and display project with the Courtauld have shown, we've got some beautifully complementary paintings now within the collections. But the genesis of these things were probably as different as they could be. So Lady Barber did not have a large art collection. She had some important 17th century tapestries in her collection. She had some portraits of herself, a few objects. Robert knows that I dislike portraits of herself. So she wasn't a huge collector, but she was dedicated to the arts and actually a very accomplished pianist. So her vision was always to set up an institute in memory of her husband that would be endowed with the funds to construct a building and then to acquire works of art. And she was very specific about how that should be done. So this was not to include gifts, and actually that was constituted in the deed originally, so no further gifts should be accepted, nor loans to the institute. And that actually carried on for quite some time, until around 1995, when I think that was dissolved and we could accept loans into the gallery. So rather, there was a fund established through the sale of some property deeds. Henri Barber was a solicitor and property owner in Birmingham. And it was the directive of the directors of the Barber Institute to establish this collection in the manner they saw fit, but absolutely not to move towards modernism. So there again is a kind of interesting distinction. It was up to 1900 and not beyond. In Lady Barber's eyes, she really did not like modernism. So that carried on for quite some time as the deed, and more recently it's been relaxed. So now, for example, we can borrow works. We have a number of works on long-term loan. We do temporary exhibition projects, engaging with academics in the department and more widely, and using our own research. And we can purchase works at the moment which are up to 30 years old. So we still have a restriction. And that is something that we are discussing, and it has been an interesting discussion recently in a space which is also for learning and in which students want to study. And we're of course seeing rise in popularity of students who are interested in studying modern and contemporary practice, but that is not reflected really in the Barber's collection. So our strengths still remain in the Impressionist, Post-Impressionism, 17th century Dutch painting, early acquisitions really that Bodkin made between his appointment in 1935 and the opening of the gallery, where he really purchased some significant paintings, including our Manet and other works from, ranging from Simone Martini to our Monet and others. So it's just interesting to reflect on that journey and how a deed such as Lady Barber's also does need to evolve, you know, respectfully of the intention, but also thinking about the function of a museum today in the context of Birmingham as well as a city.
And a challenge I think both of our institutions have always, given the character that we've got, particularly over the recent decades, is that challenge of how do you make the most of all that curatorial expertise and the great collection, together with all the academic expertise and research that's happening across the academic department, and making those two things really knit together to become more than the sum of their two parts, I guess, is the challenge that we always face, and that the Courtauld has always faced as an institution. And we're really encouraging, I think, on one of the great aspects of reuniting the Institute with the gallery over the coming years is really that opportunity for our curators and our academic colleagues to work really closely together. They do so already, but to really encourage that kind of work and to think about the ways in which teaching and the public engagement that we have really crisscrosses between both the Institute and the gallery. And I think that's the great challenge that institutions like ours, which do have this bifurcated character in some ways, are really need to address and are excited about addressing.
It's also the strength of university museums. And I've been to numerous forums around university-based museums recently, and thinking about, you know, what is the place of the university-based museum or art gallery in comparison to civic space, and what is our position? And I think one of the things that we're excited about is really to up our game in terms of this, thinking about that interdisciplinarity again, and the connectedness of research across the arts, but also through other fields. And a lot of the Barber's public programme work engages with health. We have made changes through placements with nursing practitioners to policy, and I think university spaces are so well positioned to translate that research into real impact, which is also what our funders expect us to do, but it really does impact on people's lives. So we're excited about that. We're also pushing further towards the contemporary also, and you know, we've all heard of the announcements of the NG as well and their collecting policy, moving into that space. I think that we are interested in working with contemporary artists who have an interest in their practice, either in research as a process, or working with objects, and thinking about new ways of telling stories. So we're quite excited about that, and that is quite new for the Barber.
Great.
So
I'm just conscious, it's 10 to 8 already. We're supposed to be finished at 7:30, weren't we, Chloe? So I don't want to keep all of you too long away from your drinks and from the rest of your evening. So I think we should really probably wrap up there and say, just wanted to say that this collaboration between the Courtauld and the Barber has been really extraordinary for us. I think it's been wonderful for our visitors to have the chance to see some of the greatest works in your collection and to think about the relationships between those works and our collection. I think the display has been really beautiful, has been beautifully curated, Chloe. I want to say huge thanks to you and your colleagues, not only for organising tonight, but for helping put together such a beautiful display. And I know the collaboration between the Barber and the Courtauld teams has been a really fruitful and friendly one, and hopefully generative. And because our two institutes are quite unique but quite similar to each other, and so I think there's a really great opportunity for partnership going forward.
thank you. And just to finally say, I can see people want to get to the wine or home. But thank you, Mark. Thank you, Chloe. Thank you to all the team here. Thank you to everyone who's spoken this evening. I think those presentations show how important engagement with objects is still. And we would love to invite you all back to Barber when we reopen soon.
Thank you.